Please relax and let's dive into the depths of history and explore those ancient mysteries that science has so far failed to fully reveal. Please close your eyes or just let your gaze drift gently over these words and feel the serenity and contemplation that the flood of time brings. Chapter 1. The Ancient Circumnavigation of Africa, a Sun in the North. If you will picture this, around 600 BC, an extraordinary scene was unfolding on Egypt's Red Sea coast. A squadron of Phoenician ships was preparing to set sail into the unknown. These vessels were commissioned by the pharaoh himself. Their mission sounded so unbelievable, even audacious, to keep going south and west, attempting to achieve what no one in their world had ever dared before, to circumnavigate Africa and successfully return home. If this story holds true, it implies that 2 millennia before the age of discovery, ancient mariners may have already achieved what later explorers heralded as a groundbreaking feat. Notably, the Greek historian Herodotus recorded the account, and even he found it hard to believe. Yet, intriguingly, one specific detail the Phoenician sailors reported hints that the story might just be true. Something about the unusual position of the sun during their journey. Modern historians are now left to wonder, did these ancient Phoenicians, sailing for Egypt, truly accomplish the impossible? Or is this a legend that has been embellished over time? Necho II, who ruled from 610 to 595 BC, was an ambitious pharaoh of Egypt's 26th dynasty. His kingdom, recently freed from Assyrian domination, was eager to reclaim its power on the world stage. Necho fought major conflicts in the east against rising powers like Babylonia, but after some defeats, he shifted his focus to bold infrastructure and maritime projects. One grand endeavor was his attempt to dig a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, essentially a forerunner of the Suez Canal, though that canal was never completed, partly due to cost and the risk of his enemies using it as well. It clearly shows Necho's vision of Egypt as a trading and naval power. While earlier pharaohs had sent ships to trade with the land of Punt on Africa's eastern coast, no recorded Egyptian voyage had ever pushed beyond those known waters into the open ocean. Necho took unprecedented steps to build up a navy, but despite being a visionary, he realized that naval tradition is built up over generations, not over the course of a few years. Luckily for him, the Egyptians were the immediate neighbors of the greatest mariners in the ancient world. Necho recruited veteran mariners from Phoenicia to man his fleets on the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts. Notably, Egypt and the Phoenician city-states also shared a common rival in Babylon, which made them natural partners in exploration and enterprise. It was in this context that Necho set in motion an extraordinary expedition to answer a daring question. Could sailors depart Egypt, sail south and west, and come back around Africa to the Nile? Herodotus, writing about 150 years after Necho's reign, provides the principal account of this voyage, and he likely heard the tale from Egyptian priests. Herodotus relates that Necho's hired Phoenician sailors set out from Egypt's Red Sea coast and headed south. hugging the coast as they navigated into unknown waters. They took nearly 3 years to return, sailing in stages and coming ashore each autumn to sow grain and replenish their food before continuing onward. In the end, the crew passed westward through the Pillars of Heracles, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, and sailed back into the Nile Delta. According to Herodotus, they became the first to prove that Africa was surrounded by sea rather than linked to Asia as commonly believed. The sailors brought back one astonishing report. At one point in the far south, the sun appeared to the north of them, to the right of their ship as they sailed west. Interestingly, this detail, which is now the best evidence in favor of the historicity of this event, was seen in a very different light by Herodotus. He found that he couldn't believe this detail. Yet, it's precisely what would happen to observers voyaging below the equator, lending some credence to the story. Apart from Herodotus' narrative, no other contemporary record confirms the voyage. Many later writers in antiquity were skeptical that such a circumnavigation ever occurred. By the Roman era, for example, geographers like Ptolemy still argued that Africa's southern oceans were landlocked. This is a sign that if the Phoenicians did sail around Africa, their feat was not widely believed. Not long after Necho's time, the Carthaginian explorer Hanno voyaged down the African west coast, though his crew went beyond the Gulf of Guinea before turning back. Unlike the voyage sponsored by Necho, Hanno the navigator, as he's known to history, wrote a first-person account of his journey, which survives to this day in a Greek translation. Herodotus also tells of a Persian who was ordered by Xerxes to sail from the Atlantic around Africa, though this journey is much more speculative than the other expeditions. In modern times, historians continue to debate whether this Egyptian-sponsored Phoenician circumnavigation really happened. Many consider Herodotus' report plausible, noting that the Phoenicians retained by Necho certainly had the skills and ships to attempt it. The reported 3-year duration and that extraordinary sun on the right observation align with what we now know would occur on a southward journey around Africa. Ancient vessels could ride seasonal winds and currents to slowly make their way around the Cape, and the Phoenicians were adept at long-distance seafaring. On the other hand, some scholars remain skeptical. They emphasize the lack of corroborating evidence and question why Necho would fund a costly voyage of discovery with no obvious, immediate payoff. However, historians have also observed that Necho was the sort of visionary ruler who tried to build the Suez Canal more than 2 millennia before it was actually constructed. He may have imagined that this voyage would open up new trade routes that would have brought untold riches to Egypt. Notably, the Egyptians traded heavily with the land of Punt in what is now Somalia, and may have seen this ability to navigate around Africa as a means to cut them out. Further, when he ordered the voyage, he of course had no idea how long it would take. While the Mediterranean and Red Sea portion of the trip would have been known, the rest was essentially guesswork, and it wasn't clear that they wouldn't just hit land going south. Surprisingly, the voyage has actually been tested in modern times. From 2008 to 2010, explorer Philip Bell and a team sailed a replica 6th century Phoenician ship around Africa, duplicating the route described by Herodotus. This voyage, which took them about 2 years, roughly mirrored the ancient timeline, when accounting for the fact they didn't drop anchor to farm new supplies. This experiment proved that a ship from Necho's era could theoretically manage the voyage. While it can't confirm the story directly, it lends circumstantial credibility by showing the feat was technically feasible. But this circumstantial evidence needs to be taken into account with that tidbit about the sun that Herodotus found impossible. In 600 BC, no Near Eastern or Mediterranean society had worked out the concept of an equator where the sun could appear in the northern sky. That detail in Herodotus, dismissed by him as unbelievable, makes sense precisely because it would have astonished sailors who lacked any prior theoretical expectation. Adding even more credibility to the account, Herodotus noted that this event occurred at the furthest southern point. The unusual position of the sun would only have become apparent the further south the sailors went. In short, this is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that the voyagers likely made it at least as far as the Cape of Good Hope, since they couldn't have known this fact otherwise. This, of course, doesn't definitively prove that they completed the circumnavigation from that point onwards. However, if they didn't complete the circumnavigation, it begs the question why the ancient voyage took roughly the same time as the modern reenactment. Whether Pharaoh Necho's African circumnavigation happened or not, the legend has secured a place in the history of exploration. If the voyage was real, it stands as one of humanity's great maritime achievements. It would push back the first known journey around the whole African continent by 2 millennia. It also means the initial credit for pioneering the Cape route belongs not to the Portuguese explorers of the 15th century, but to a band of Phoenician sailors under an Egyptian king. Even if the story was exaggerated or apocryphal, it may have inspired the well-documented epic voyage of Hanno the Navigator about a century later. It may also explain why Hanno's first-hand account of that voyage was secretive in relation to certain details. Perhaps the Carthaginians believed that the Egyptians, with the help of their Phoenician forebears, may still be interested in the route around Africa. While I previously discussed circumstantial evidence, there is still the potential for definitive proof that the expedition was factual to be found. Herodotus doesn't specify how many ships took part in the voyage, though he does mention that sailors went out in ships, plural. Because of this omission, modern historians can only speculate on how many ships might have been involved. Most tend to assume it was a small expedition of a handful of ships at most. This estimate is based on practical concerns, as a small fleet would have been easier to supply and easier to maneuver long unknown coastlines. Definitive proof of Necho's Phoenician circumnavigation would need artifacts that unambiguously connect 6th century BC Phoenicians to coastlines far beyond the Red Sea and Mediterranean. The strongest candidate would be a Phoenician shipwreck found off southern Africa or on the Atlantic coast. This, of course, would be a very unlikely find given the passage of time and the fact that we don't even know if any of the ships were lost on the voyage. A second line of evidence would be the coastal landing sites. According to Herodotus, the Phoenicians set up temporary communities to farm and resupply. Perhaps the best possible evidence would be an out-of-place Phoenician inscription located somewhere in southern or western Africa. Phoenician sailors occasionally left behind graffiti or other inscriptions, and such an inscription carved into an immovable object and dated from around that time would be irrefutable evidence. Whether Necho's expedition occurred remains one of ancient history's greatest unsolved mysteries. While it can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the circumstantial evidence suggests that, on a balance of probabilities, the Phoenician crew likely at least made it to the Cape of Good Hope. Chapter 2: The Enigma of the Lost Queen, Tracing Nefertiti's Tomb. Now, let's turn our gaze to another legendary figure of ancient Egypt. A mysterious queen hailed as the beautiful one has come, Nefertiti. Queen Nefertiti remains one of ancient Egypt's most iconic and mysterious figures. Over 3,300 years ago, she ruled alongside Pharaoh Akhenaten during the 18th dynasty, an era of great opulence and religious upheaval. Her name, which means the beautiful one has come, is perhaps fitting. A famous painted bust discovered in 1912 immortalized her striking features and cemented her status as a global symbol of beauty and power millennia after her death. Historically, though, Nefertiti wasn't only celebrated for her looks. She was the great royal wife of Akhenaten and played a pivotal role in a revolutionary experiment in monotheism. Together, the royal couple upended centuries of tradition by elevating the sun-disk god as the sole god, dismantling the old worship of Amun and other deities. Nefertiti has become particularly fascinating as she's depicted in contemporary artwork participating in rituals and smiting enemies, scenes typically reserved for pharaohs. Some scholars believe she wielded power in her own right alongside Akhenaten, and may have even ruled independently for a brief period after his death. In fact, famed Egyptologist Zahi Hawass and others suggest Nefertiti assumed a pharaoh's title during the turbulent transition following Akhenaten's reign. This theory, while not universally accepted, demonstrates Nefertiti's unique status in this royal system. By the time young Tutankhamun took the throne, Nefertiti had vanished from the record. How and when she perished remains unknown, and her tomb has likely never been found. Around the 12th to 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti seemingly fades from history. Records of her death are non-existent, and contemporaries left no clear indication of where she was buried. The royal family at that time was based in the new capital Akhetaten, modern Amarna, where Akhenaten built a grand city and a royal tomb in the desert cliffs. It's possible Nefertiti was meant to be interred at Amarna, but archaeologists have no evidence of her burial in the Amarna royal tomb. In later years, her son-in-law, King Tut, moved the court back to Thebes, and the Aten worship era was declared heresy. Subsequent pharaohs attempted to erase the entire Aten episode from history. Statues were smashed, and names and images of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were chiseled out, and the heretic queen was virtually wiped from the official record. This systematic erasure was so effective that Nefertiti's legacy lay in obscurity until modern archaeology rediscovered traces of her life. But it also means clues to her death and burial were deliberately obscured. While the mummies of many 18th dynasty royals have been identified, Nefertiti's remains have never been conclusively found. In recent years, one leading hypothesis captured worldwide attention: the idea that Nefertiti's tomb might be hidden within or directly adjacent to King Tut's tomb. This theory was most prominently championed by British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves. In 2015, Reeves announced that high-resolution laser scans of the tomb walls reveal something fascinating. There were subtle fissures and outlines suggesting to seal doorways behind the plastered and painted surfaces. One of these hidden doorways, he proposed, could lead to an unexplored storage chamber, and the other could be the entrance to Nefertiti's lost burial chamber. Reeves pointed out that Tut's tomb is unusually small for a pharaoh and appears to have a layout suitable for a queen's burial. This implied the young king may have been interred in an antechamber of an existing tomb originally made for Nefertiti. He also noted peculiarities in the tomb's artwork. The painted figures on the north wall depict his successor performing rites. He suggested they seem to have been altered from earlier depictions of the pharaoh performing those rites for his predecessor. In other words, Reeves argued that the scene was initially meant to show Tut burying Nefertiti, and only later was it modified to show the next pharaoh burying Tut. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities took Reeves' theory seriously enough to authorize a series of investigations. In 2015 and 2016, teams conducted ground-penetrating radar scans inside Tut's tomb to detect voids or passages behind the walls. An initial scan by a Japanese specialist appeared to support the existence of hidden cavities. However, a follow-up scan funded by National Geographic was negative, finding no clear anomalies. To resolve the conflicting results, a third, more comprehensive radar survey was conducted in 2017 and 2018 by independent experts. In the words of one report, the high-confidence conclusion was that no hidden chambers adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb exist. These findings tempered the excitement, and many archaeologists grew skeptical that Nefertiti lies behind Tut's painted walls. Interestingly, the story didn't end there. In 2020, another twist emerged when a former Egyptian antiquities minister led a high-tech radar survey of the broader area around the tomb. This team detected what appeared to be an unknown corridor and a large chamber a few meters north of the tomb. The discovery was leaked, and it was suggested that there may be a hidden 32-foot-wide chamber. As of yet, that subsurface anomaly hasn't been excavated or confirmed to be a tomb, so it remains an intriguing possibility. Meanwhile, Reeves added new evidence to his theory in 2020 by identifying previously overlooked hieroglyphic traces on Tutankhamun's tomb paintings. He claimed that inscriptions naming King Tut were painted over earlier ones that name Nefertiti, implying the space originally belonged to her. The enduring mystery of Nefertiti's tomb has given rise to a range of speculative theories, some more plausible than others. One persistent idea is that Nefertiti was buried at Amarna and later moved. If she died during Akhenaten's reign, she might have originally been interred in the Amarna royal tomb along with her daughter Menkaten. who died young and was definitely buried there. When Tut abandoned Amarna, loyalists could have taken Nefertiti's remains out and re-entered her quietly in Thebes to protect her from desecration. In this scenario, her tomb in Amarna may have been destroyed or left empty. Supporting this, archaeologists at Amarna found fragments of royal coffins and equipment that hint some mummies were relocated. However, no inscription explicitly naming Nefertiti has surfaced there, and so this theory remains circumstantial. Another theory suggests that Nefertiti might have a tomb in the Valley of the Queens or another part of the Theban Hills. As the principal wife of a pharaoh, she could have been buried in a separate royal wife's tomb rather than the main Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Queens, where queens of later dynasties were buried, has been explored, but many tombs there were heavily looted. Meanwhile, Zahi Hawass has been actively pursuing a different angle in an attempt to crack this case. Hawass has for years led a project re-examining and identified mummies from the late 18th dynasty using modern DNA analysis. In particular, 2 mummified women from tomb KV-21 have drawn attention. Located in the Valley of the Kings, KV-21 contained 2 female bodies, designated KV-1A and KV-1B, that were poorly preserved. Preliminary DNA tests a decade ago hinted that KV-1A might be the mother of the 2 infant daughters of Tutankhamun found in his tomb. This suggested KV-1A could be Ankhesenamun, who was Nefertiti's daughter as well as King Tut's wife. If so, it stands to reason that the other mummy KV-1B found alongside her could be Queen Nefertiti herself. Nefertiti was believed to be somewhere around 45 years old when she dropped off the historical record. Interestingly, experts who have analyzed KV-1B concluded that she was about 45 years old at the time of her death. Unfortunately, the DNA sample that was initially taken was too degraded to yield any usable data at the time. In the intervening years, however, scientists have made rapid progress in the ability to analyze DNA from degraded samples. Hawass announced in 2022 that his team had obtained new samples from KV-1B and other remains, and would soon be in the position to reveal results. He confidently stated that by comparing the genetic profiles of known mummies like Akhenaten and other relatives, they expect to name Nefertiti's mummy at last. At present, the results of this testing haven't been released to the public, and it's unclear if the current samples taken yielded usable DNA evidence. At any rate, if Zahi Hawass is correct, Nefertiti's mummy may already have been discovered, and perhaps the mystery is just awaiting DNA confirmation. That would solve one piece of the puzzle, her physical remains, but not necessarily pinpoint the location of her original tomb. If KV-1B is in fact Nefertiti, it's not entirely clear whether the KV-1 tomb site was her initial burial site or a later place her body was moved to by loyalists. The tomb is generally viewed as lacking sufficient grandeur for someone of Nefertiti's status, suggesting that there may be a more significant site that has yet to be discovered. The ancient mysteries continue to whisper from the depths of history. They perhaps will never be fully unraveled. But it is precisely this allure of the unknown that drives us to continually explore and question. In these stories, we feel the courage, wisdom, and longing for the unknown that animated the ancients. May these whispers from antiquity bring you a sense of calm and contemplation, allowing your thoughts to gently drift upon the river of history.